Go find another table. This one's for family, not adopted girls. My sister Melissa's voice sliced through the velvet hush of Belmont's dining room, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. The words carried farther than she intended, sharp enough to turn heads at nearby tables. Then came the laughter, my parents Evelyn and Charles and my brother Eric all joining in, as though humiliation were the evening's finest entertainment. I stood there frozen, clutch pressed tight against my palm, my cheeks burning as curious eyes from across the room settled on me. Above, chandeliers spilled golden light over white linen and crystal glass, but inside I felt only the cold weight of exclusion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. My name is Claire Whitman. I'm 32 years old. I've lived with this family for 27 years, ever since they adopted me at the age of 5. And in all that time, I've never once been allowed to forget that I was not born one of them. It is a strange thing to live in the middle of a family portrait and yet feel like a shadow no one acknowledges. They dressed me in the same clothes, put me in the same schools, and posed me for the same pictures, but every smile around me was rehearsed, while mine was survival. Tonight was just another reminder. Melissa's words weren't an accident. They were the truth spoken out loud in a room too elegant for raw honesty. The waiter, a young man with anxious eyes, shifted his weight as he approached our table again. He set a leather folder in front of me as though it were a bomb he was ordered to deliver. My stomach knotted. I opened it slowly, hoping against reason that it was a mistake. $2,950. The number glared back at me like a spotlight. My breath caught. Lobster tails, vintage wine, multiple appetizers no one touched, and desserts Melissa had insisted on ordering for fun. Their indulgence was written in ink that demanded payment from me. Melissa leaned back in her chair, her smile sharp. Think of it as your contribution, Claire. You're always taking, never giving. Contribution. That word sat heavily in my chest. I had contributed my silence, my obedience, my patience, and years of unpaid emotional labor that no one ever thanked me for. Tonight they wanted my bank account too. I looked at each face around the table. Evelyn adjusted her pearl earrings, avoiding my gaze. Charles leaned back, pleased with the performance of his perfect family, the illusion intact for everyone else in the room. Eric smirked, drumming his fingers against his water glass. They were waiting for me to crack, to protest, to embarrass myself further. I did none of those things. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a silver fountain pen. It was smooth from years of being held, its weight both fragile and strong in my hand. Margaret had given it to me when I was 10, pressing it into my palm with quiet resolve. One day you'll write your own story, Claire. The click as I uncapped it sliced through the chatter. I signed the bill, steady, deliberate. The waiter's eyes flicked up to mine, sympathy swimming in them before he slipped away. Evelyn laughed lightly, waving a hand. Don't be dramatic, dear. We're just teasing. Teasing. That word again. Their favorite shield. Every insult was teasing. Every slight was teasing. And if I dared to say otherwise, I was too sensitive, too ungrateful. They had been using humor as a weapon for so long that they forgot the damage it carved. I pressed the cap back onto my pen with a soft click. To anyone else it was nothing. To me it was the sound of a ledger marking another entry, another wound, another debt. Silence was my record-keeping. Conversation flowed on without me, voices weaving around me like I was invisible. Melissa bragged about her new condo, Evelyn doted on Eric's promotion, and Charles asked about future investments. They poured their pride into each other like wine into glasses full and overflowing. For me, not even a drop. I sipped from my water, my hands steady now. I had learned to make invisibility my armor. When dessert came, tall confections stacked like monuments to indulgence, I excused myself. My voice was even calm. They barely noticed. Only Melissa's eyes flicked toward me, confused by the absence of protest. She thrived on my reaction. Tonight, I gave her none. I walked past the velvet curtains and into the night. The air outside bit at my cheeks, cold but clean. Chicago's streets shimmered under winter lights, the pavement slick with frost. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, the silver pen resting secure in my palm. Each step away from Belmont's felt like stepping out of their portrait and into my own frame. For a moment I stood still, breathing in the city air, letting it wash the humiliation off my skin. My mind replayed every laugh, every smirk, every reminder that I was not theirs. But beneath the sting, there was something steadier. Clarity. A recognition that silence tonight was not defeat. It was preservation. It was the opening page of something new. As I turned down the street, the pen clicked softly in my hand. That sound had followed me for years, through exams, through job interviews, through lonely birthdays where no one called. It was more than metal and ink. It was proof that someone, at least one person, had believed I was worthy of writing my own story. That night, I promised myself I would. Not by shouting in a restaurant or demanding a seat at their table, but by keeping my own record. One day when the time was right, I would collect every debt they had written against me. For now, I walked into the night with my pen, my silence, and the quiet certainty that this was not the end of my story. I still remember the night air outside Belmont's clinging to me, the silver pen warm in my palm, as though it had absorbed the heat of my humiliation. I walked home slowly, each step echoing with the reminder of who I was in their eyes and who I refused to remain. When I finally closed the door of my apartment, silence greeted me. A different silence from the restaurant. Not cruel or watchful, just quiet. A kind of stillness that let memory rise uninvited but insistent, pulling me backward to years I thought I had already buried. The memory that surfaced first was from when I was 10 years old. Birthdays in our house were never small. At least not for Melissa or Eric. I can still see the banners strung across the living room, the balloons bobbing near the ceiling, the tables covered in cakes and gifts wrapped in glossy paper. Melissa was only a few years older than me, but her birthdays looked like weddings. Friends crowded the house, music blared, and Evelyn's laughter carried from the kitchen, while Charles stood proudly near the door, greeting every guest like a host at a grand ball. That year, Melissa turned 13. She had been granted a theme party complete with a catered buffet and a professional photographer. I remember standing in the corner, my hands folded in front of me, wearing a dress passed down from one of Evelyn's cousins. The lace itched at my collarbone, and the hem was too long, brushing the floor and tripping me every time I tried to move. I stood there, awkwardly smiling when told, silent when ignored. As Melissa blew out the candles on her three-tier cake, cheers erupted around her. Eric clapped so hard his palms must have stung. Evelyn dabbed at her eyes as though she had birthed an angel who had just achieved sainthood. Charles kissed Melissa on the cheek, whispering words of pride that reached my ears as fragments. "You're our star, our miracle, our pride." And me. I waited until the room quieted down and guests began slicing into that perfect cake. When one of Melissa's friends pushed a plate toward me, the frosting already smeared and the slice uneven, I accepted it gratefully. It was what I had learned to do, to be grateful for whatever scraps I was offered. But when I took a bite, the sweetness coated my tongue like a mask. It didn't taste like a celebration. It tasted like absence. That was my 10th birthday. No balloons, no banners, no candles with my name sung out loud. Only a leftover piece of cake from a party that wasn't mine. That day taught me something I didn't fully understand until much later, that sometimes you can be inside a family's house, eat their food, wear their hand-me-downs, and still never belong. I remember slipping away from the crowd, clutching that plate of cake, and finding a quiet spot in the back garden. The grass was damp under my shoes, the air heavy with the scent of roses Evelyn tended for show. I sat on the steps staring at the crumbs, wondering if this was all my birthdays would ever be. That was when I felt a hand rest gently on my shoulder. Margaret. My grandmother by law, not by blood. Evelyn's mother. She was a tall woman, her posture always regal, but her eyes were softer than anyone else's in that house. She didn't waste words on appearances or reputations. She noticed things. She noticed me. That day she carried a small velvet pouch. Without ceremony, she placed it in my lap. "Open it," she said, her voice steady, almost like a command, but warmer somehow. I pulled at the drawstrings, and inside was a silver fountain pen, sleek, heavy for its size, gleaming in the fading sunlight. My breath caught. No one had ever given me something so clearly meant just for me. One day, she told me, "You'll write your own story, not theirs." I stared at her, too young to grasp the depth of what she meant, but old enough to recognize the seriousness in her eyes. The pen glimmered between us, and in that moment, it felt like a secret alliance, a promise sealed in silver. While everyone else in that house was celebrating Melissa, Margaret was acknowledging me. That pen became my talisman. I carried it to school, tucked it under my pillow at night, and used it to scribble my thoughts in notebooks that no one else would ever read. When I failed, the pen reminded me I could begin again. When I succeeded, it was proof that some part of me was real and worth marking down. But birthdays never changed. Year after year, Melissa and Eric were celebrated with grandeur, while mine slipped by like an afterthought. Evelyn would hand me a cupcake on the way to a meeting, Charles might pat my shoulder absent-mindedly, and Melissa would sneer about how lucky I was to be included at all. And Eric would laugh, reminding me that without them, I would be nothing. I believed them for a long time. That belief sank into my bones like cold rain, until Margaret's words began to grow louder than theirs. "Write your own story." I began to notice the spaces where their love should have been and wasn't. I began to see the difference between performance and truth. Sitting in my apartment decades later, the memory pressed against me like a wave. I reached for the same pen, now aged, its surface scratched, but its weight unchanged. I held it against my palm and closed my eyes, hearing Margaret's voice, as if she were beside me again. The sound of laughter from Belmont's faded, replaced by the echo of children cheering at Melissa's 13th birthday. The smell of roses returned, the sting of being overlooked washed over me once more. Sometimes the past does not stay buried. It waits for the right humiliation to resurrect it. That night at Belmont's was not the first time I was told I wasn't family. It was simply the loudest. I leaned back on my couch, staring at the ceiling of my modest apartment. No chandeliers, no velvet curtains, no carefully curated perfection. Just a quiet room filled with objects that were truly mine. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to exhale. People often think pain is loud. In truth, the deepest pain is quiet. It does not scream. It lingers in silence, carving lines that only the sufferer can trace. That was the lesson my childhood taught me, and it is why silence has always been my weapon. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, pulling me back into the present. My hands trembled as I tucked the pen back into its case. My eyes burned, but no tears came. I had shed enough over the years. Tears had never moved them, never softened their laughter. They only fed it. That night, I realized something else. The greatest gift Margaret gave me was not the pen itself, but the belief that my story mattered enough to be written. That belief had carried me through years of being invisible. It had kept me alive in a house that tried to erase me. As I closed the box and set it back on the shelf, I whispered to the empty room what I never dared to say out loud in that house. I am not theirs to define. The city lights blinked through my window, tiny reminders that beyond their walls, there was a world where belonging could be chosen, not assigned. And maybe, just maybe, the time was coming when I would stop recording debts in silence and start collecting them. The pen clicked softly in my hand again. To someone else, it was the sound of ink being sealed away. To me, it was the sound of resolve. And in that quiet resolve, I understood Margaret's words more than ever. Love, real love, does not always come from blood. Sometimes it comes from the one person who sees you when everyone else refuses to. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a silver pen pressed into the hand of a forgotten child, carrying a promise that one day she will write her own story. I sat alone in my apartment that night, the silver pen still resting on my coffee table, as if it had been watching me all these years and was now waiting for me to make the first move. The humiliation from Belmont clung to me like smoke. I could still hear Melissa's voice, still see Evelyn's dismissive wave, still feel Eric's smug amusement. My chest tightened, but my hands were steady as I pulled my laptop onto my knees. For years I had avoided digging too deep. Some part of me had been afraid of what I might find if I went searching through the shadows of my own life. But humiliation has a way of breaking fear. That night, I decided to stop being afraid. The screen glowed in the dim room. I opened my bank account first, scrolling through familiar numbers that seemed too small to shoulder the weight of that dinner bill. My breath caught. I knew how tight my budget was. Every paycheck was mapped out down to the dollar. Rent, student loans, groceries, business expenses. There was no margin for luxury, not when I had built everything from the ground up without an ounce of help from the people who should have been my safety net. I clicked through old statements, not even sure what I was looking for until something caught my eye. A line buried deep in a section I had never paid much attention to before. A reference to a trust. Whitman Trust 1993. My name was attached. My pulse quickened. I stared at the words, blinking hard as if the screen were playing tricks on me. Whitman Trust. The year I was adopted. My name. It didn't make sense. I had never heard anyone mention a trust in my name, not once in 27 years. Curiosity turned to suspicion, and suspicion turned to determination. I typed the name into a search bar, fingers moving fast now, adrenaline rushing through me. At first, nothing relevant appeared, just a scattering of unrelated financial articles. But then a link surfaced to an old government archive, a dusty corner of the internet that most people never stumble into. I clicked it, my heart pounding in my ears. A PDF file loaded slowly, the cursor spinning, as if testing my resolve. When it opened, I saw the title in bold letters across the top. Whitman Adoption Grant 1993. My stomach lurched. Adoption grant. My name appeared again alongside Evelyn's and Charles's signatures. The words blurred as my mind raced to connect them. Money had been allocated. Not to me directly, but in my name for my benefit to support my upbringing. A sum that was meant to ensure my care and my education. The figure stared back at me. $850,000. I covered my mouth with my hand, the room spinning. $850,000 had been given in my name when I was 5 years old. Money meant to support me as I grew, money that could have changed everything about my life. And I had spent my childhood wearing secondhand dresses, watching Melissa get brand new clothes every season. I had scraped my way through community college, working 2 jobs to cover tuition, while Eric received a fully funded education. I had begged for a loan to start my business, laughed at by my own parents, when all along there had been more than enough. The betrayal cut deeper than any insult at a restaurant ever could. This wasn't just cruelty. This was theft. I zoomed in on the document, my eyes catching on the fine print. The funds had been released in annual installments managed by Charles and Evelyn as my legal guardians. I scrolled through the distribution notes. Vacations, private schooling, investments, all of it in their names, not mine. My hands trembled as I scrolled faster, as if racing against time to see how much of my life had been stolen without me ever knowing. The glow of the screen reflected off my pen lying nearby, its silver barrel catching the light in a way that made the words on the screen shimmer with a strange familiarity. Whitman Trust, 1993. The ink on the PDF header looked like it had been etched with the same metallic sheen. My mind spun with the realization that the one gift Margaret had given me, the pen, had been foreshadowing all along. A symbol of truth, of story, of ownership. And now it was staring back at me in black and white proof that my life had been rewritten by people who claimed to be my family. I whispered it aloud before I could stop myself. So they did take something meant for me. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was small, but steady. It felt like the first line in a new chapter. A notification pinged suddenly on my screen, making me flinch. An email alert. I clicked over, my heart still racing. A message from my credit monitoring service reminding me of a subscription renewal. The timing was eerie, like the universe nudging me to pay attention. I returned to the PDF and hit print listening as the machine hummed to life across the room. Each page slid out slowly, tangible proof of what I had discovered. I gathered them carefully, my fingers brushing across the lines of betrayal. I sat back, clutching the stack of papers against my chest. For years I had let their laughter define me, but now I had something they couldn't laugh away. Numbers don't lie. Documents don't forget. My silence had been my weapon, but this was ammunition. I stared out the window at the city lights, their reflections trembling across the glass. How many nights had I sat here convincing myself I was too sensitive, too weak, too ungrateful? How many times had I swallowed the ache of being treated as less? The truth was clearer than ever now. I had not imagined the cruelty. I had not exaggerated the injustice. They had stolen from me, and they dared to demand more. I turned the pen over in my hand, the metal cool against my skin. Margaret's words echoed through my mind again. One day you'll write your own story, not theirs. Maybe that day had finally come. I pressed the stack of papers onto my desk, aligning them carefully as though precision could bring order to the chaos of my past. Each page whispered a different kind of betrayal: vacations. Melissa bragged about cars. Eric flaunted investments. Charles and Evelyn boasted over. All built on money that was supposed to feed and clothe me, to educate me, to give me a future. I thought about the lessons people draw from betrayal. Some believe betrayal makes you stronger. Others believe it makes you bitter. For me, it did something else. It made me see the truth. That family is not defined by last names or photographs on a wall. It is defined by trust. And mine had been broken long before I ever understood what trust meant. I leaned forward, whispering again as if affirming it to myself. They stole from me, but they will not steal what comes next. The printer fell silent. The last page landed with a soft thud. I gathered them into a folder, sliding the pen across the top. My fingers lingered on the cap before I clicked it shut. That sound was different now. Not just a marker of memory. It was the sound of resolve. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room, the tick of the clock steady. For the first time in a long time, I felt something other than pain. I felt purpose. I glanced at the PDF still open on my laptop screen, the bold letters glowing like a challenge. Whitman Trust, 1993. It wasn't just a document. It was the seed of a reckoning. And as I sat there in the dim light of my apartment, the folder heavy in my lap, I realized something important. The truth does not always reveal itself in grand gestures or dramatic confessions. Sometimes it hides in archives in fine print in the quiet corners no one bothers to check. It waits for the moment the victim is ready to become more than a victim. That night, I was ready. I clicked my laptop shut, the sound echoing through the room like the closing of one book and the opening of another. My story was no longer theirs to tell. The folder of printed documents still lay heavy on my lap that night, my fingers running along the edge of the pages, as though the paper itself might cut me with every stroke. Whitman Trust, 1993. $850,000. Proof that my life had been subsidized not for me, but for them. Betrayal glared at me in black and white. I should have felt relief for having finally uncovered the truth, but instead, there was only a deeper, sharper ache. Betrayal is never a single wound. It echoes, it reverberates, it threads itself through every memory you thought you understood. The silence of my apartment wrapped itself around me, and I sat staring out the window at the shimmer of the city when my phone buzzed. A message. My heart skipped as I reached for it. The name on the screen made me blink. Daniel, the manager at Belmont's. We had barely exchanged words beyond pleasantries when I had paid the bill. Why would he be contacting me now? I unlocked the phone and read. You should know. They put the bill in your name months ago. My breath caught. I read it again and again, as though my mind refused to accept what the words meant. Months ago. This was not an isolated act of cruelty. born from Melissa's spite that evening. This was something orchestrated, planned. I whispered aloud, without meaning to. Months ago. The phone trembled in my hand. The truth has a way of arriving in pieces, each fragment sharp enough to cut each one, forcing you to bleed just a little more. That message was another cut. I typed back with shaking fingers. What do you mean? The dots pulsed on the screen before his reply came. They laughed about it. Said it was your contribution. Contribution. That word again. Used as both accusation and excuse. I could almost hear Melissa's tone in Daniel's message dripping with mock sweetness. My mind reeled. How many dinners had they charged to me without my knowledge? How many nights had they feasted their laughter echoing under crystal chandeliers, knowing the bill would eventually find its way to me? I hit call before I could stop myself. The phone rang once, twice, and then Daniel answered. His voice was low, cautious, as if he had already risked too much by sending those texts. Claire, I'm sorry. I shouldn't even be saying this, but I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I swallowed hard. Tell me everything. There was a pause. You know I've managed Belmonts for years. Your family has always been considered an important client, but in the last few months, I started noticing something. Every time they booked, your name was added to the reservation, even when you weren't there. At first I thought it was a mistake, but then I overheard Melissa telling the staff not to worry because you would cover it. They laughed like it was a private joke. My grip on the phone tightened. How many? Too many, he admitted. Thousands. I know this could cost me my job, but I had to tell you. Watching you stand there the other night, paying for them while they mocked you, I couldn't stay silent. I closed my eyes, the room tilting. My entire life with them had been framed as a joke at my expense. A system designed to remind me daily that I was less than. Now I realized it wasn't just emotional cruelty. It was financial exploitation. They were not simply mocking me. They were feeding off me. Thank you. I whispered, my voice barely audible. Thank you for telling me. Daniel sighed. I'm sorry, Claire. They called it your contribution. I call it theft. When the line disconnected, I let the phone slip from my hand. It landed on the table with a dull thud, and in the movement my silver pen rolled off beside it. The clink of metal against wood pierced the silence, echoing louder than it should have. I stared at both objects, the phone glowing with betrayal and the pen glinting with promise. Two truths side by side. One reminded me of how they had stolen. The other reminds me of how I would reclaim. For a long moment I didn't move. I just sat in the half-light of my apartment, breathing slowly, trying to keep from breaking apart. Betrayal repeated is no longer an accident. It is a system. It is a strategy. That realization hardened something inside me. What they had done was not just cruelty disguised as teasing. It was a pattern, a machine that operated because I had allowed silence to be mistaken for surrender. The pages of the trust lay still on my desk, the ink glaring up at me like a witness. The phone screen dimmed, but Daniel's words still pulsed in my chest. They laughed about it, said it was your contribution. I felt the anger rise, slow but certain, like water filling a vessel. Not the wild anger that burns quickly and fades. This was the steady, simmering kind that reshapes you. I leaned forward and picked up the pen, turning it slowly in my fingers. Margaret had given it to me when I was a child, overlooked at a birthday party. Back then, it was a symbol of love. Tonight it was something more. It was a key. A reminder that stories are written by those who dare to pick up the pen and put truth into words. I opened my laptop again. If there had been one trust document hidden in the corners of an archive, maybe there was more. I searched with renewed determination, the blue light washing over my face, reflecting in my tired eyes. Each click, each scroll, each keyword felt like digging through the rubble of a collapsed building, searching for the bones of truth. And then it struck me. All those years when Evelyn and Charles had denied me small things. The school trip I couldn't afford. The computer I saved for months to buy secondhand. The braces they said were too expensive, while Melissa smiled with a perfect set paid for by their checkbook. I had believed their narrative of scarcity. We can't afford it, Claire. You must be realistic. And all along there had been a fund in my name. They had siphoned my future into their own comfort. The pen tapped against the desk unconsciously as I pieced together the fragments. Daniel's message, the adoption grant, the dinners. It was all connected, a web designed to keep me in place while they thrived on my silence. I thought of the lesson buried inside that night. When cruelty repeats itself, it ceases to be random. It becomes a ritual. And once you see the ritual for what it is, you cannot unsee it. That knowledge demands action. I whispered to myself again, the words grounding me. They stole from me, but they will not keep it. The city outside moved on as if nothing had changed. Cars hummed down the street, windows glowed in distant towers, and life continued its indifferent rhythm. But inside my apartment, everything had changed. I was no longer the girl accepting leftover cake, no longer the woman swallowing humiliation at a family dinner. I was someone holding evidence, holding memory, holding resolve. I picked up the phone again, scrolling through Daniel's message one last time before saving it. His words would be another page in the record. I pressed the pen to the corner of the folder containing the trust documents, marking it with a faint indentation, as if claiming it for my own. The night stretched long, but I did not feel tired. I felt awake in a way I never had before. Awake to the truth, awake to my worth. Awake to the realization that silence, when paired with evidence, becomes something powerful. When dawn finally bled through the curtains, I gathered the folder, the pen, and the phone, placing them carefully on the table. 3 objects, 3 witnesses. Proof that what I had endured was not just a memory, but a fact. The clink of the pen as I set it down was soft, but it rang in my mind like a bell, the beginning of a reckoning. And as I looked at the pale light of morning spilling into the room, I thought about Margaret. I imagined her voice calm and unwavering. One day you'll write your own story, not theirs. I closed my eyes and whispered back, that day has come. The morning after Daniel's call, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder of documents spread in front of me, the silver pen lying across the top like a blade. Sleep had not come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Melissa's laughter, saw Evelyn's hand dismissing me, remembered the quiet cruelty that had defined my life. But now those memories were not only wounds. They were evidence, and evidence demands to be carried somewhere safe. I knew where I needed to go. By mid-morning, I was standing in front of Margaret's house. It was a modest brick home on the edge of town. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, yet it carried a kind of dignity that mirrored her presence. The curtains were drawn back, sunlight spilling across the parlor window. I hesitated before knocking my stomach tight. Margaret had always been the only one who looked at me as if I mattered. But I hadn't told her yet what I had uncovered. I wasn't sure how she would react. When the door opened, she was already waiting as if she had known I would come. Her hair silver and neatly pinned framed a face lined with both strength and gentleness. She looked at me with eyes that saw past the smile I tried to offer straight into the storm I carried inside. Without a word, she stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The furniture was worn but cared for, cushions arranged neatly, a blanket folded on the arm of a chair. I followed her into the dining room where a pot of tea was already set on the table. Next to it sat a thick folder sealed with a clasp, and my heart thudded at the sight. She gestured for me to sit, her movements slow but deliberate. I opened my mouth to speak, but she lifted a hand. "Let me go first, Claire." Her voice was steady, the same voice that had once placed a silver pen in my hand and told me to write my own story. She reached for the folder, placed it gently on the table between us, and slid it toward me. "I have been waiting a long time to give this to you." I stared at the folder, my breath shallow. "What is it?" "Receipts," she said simply. "Proof. They took from you, Claire. But I kept receipts. I felt the words strike like a bell reverberating in the quiet room. My fingers trembled as I touched the clasp, but I didn't open it yet. I looked at her instead, searching her face. You knew? Her expression was a mixture of sorrow and resolve. I didn't know everything she admitted, but I knew enough. I saw the way Evelyn treated you, the way Charles dismissed you. I saw Melissa and Eric elevated for mediocrity while your accomplishments were ignored. I kept my eyes open because I understood something you couldn't as a child. They were using you, and I knew one day you would need the truth. I shook my head, emotions colliding inside me. Why didn't you stop them? She leaned forward, her hands folded. Because timing matters. If I had confronted them 20 years ago, they would have twisted the story, painted you as ungrateful, me as senile. They would have buried the truth beneath money and appearances. So I gathered quietly. Bank statements, contracts, evidence of the trust. I waited because I knew there would come a time when you were ready to see. The weight of her words sank into me. All these years I thought I had been alone. But she had been watching, recording, preparing. My throat ached as I whispered. And now she said firmly, you are ready. And so am I. She reached into the folder again, pulling out a sealed envelope, cream-colored with her initials pressed into the wax. She placed it beside my silver pen, the two objects side by side. The sight made my breath catch. The pen that had carried me through silence. The envelope that promised revelation. Two anchors of truth aligned. I picked it up carefully. What is this? My will, she said without hesitation. Her voice was calm, unshaken. You need to understand something, Claire. For years, everyone in this family has assumed Evelyn and Charles would inherit everything I built. They have lived as though it were already theirs, spending recklessly, treating people cruelly, certain that my fortune would catch them when they fell. They are wrong. I stared at her, stunned. You mean? She nodded. I am the principal holder of the family's assets. The house, the investments, the companies. I built them, not Evelyn, not Charles. They have lived under the illusion of ownership, but I have never relinquished control. And I never will, not to them. My mind reeled. All this time I thought Evelyn and Charles held the power, that everything flowed through them. But it was Margaret. It had always been Margaret. Her gaze was steady, unyielding. I have watched you suffer in silence, Claire. I could not erase that suffering, but I can ensure that justice finds its way to you. When the time comes, every asset they have counted on will bypass them and come to you. Not because of pity, but because you have shown resilience, integrity, and strength that they never possessed. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. I had cried enough for them. This was not the time for tears. This was the time to resolve. She reached out her hand, covering mine. I know this is heavy, but you are not alone anymore. I have kept records. I have witnesses. I have a lawyer who knows every detail. It is time to let the truth breathe. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, a quiet reminder of ordinary life, but in that room everything felt extraordinary. The balance of power I had believed in my whole life had shifted with a single envelope. I whispered, almost afraid of the words. They'll fight. Of course they will, she said with a small, wry smile. Bullies always do when their control is threatened. But remember this, Claire. Bullies thrive on silence. Once you speak, once you act, their power begins to crumble. Her words lodged deep inside me. For so long I had equated silence with survival. Now I began to see it differently. Silence had preserved me, yes. But silence was also the cage they had counted on. Breaking it would be the first act of freedom. I exhaled slowly, the pen cool in my hand, the envelope warm with promise. For the first time I felt the edges of hope pressing through the cracks of betrayal. Margaret leaned back, her eyes still sharp. There is one more thing. I have already arranged a meeting with my attorney. Tomorrow you and I will sit with him. He will walk you through every piece of evidence, every account, every safeguard. They will not take another dollar, another ounce of dignity from you. The words settled over me like a mantle heavy but protective. Tomorrow. For years, I had waited for someone to see me, to believe me, to stand with me. Tomorrow, that waiting would end. I closed the folder, slowly pressing the pen across it, as though sealing a contract between past and future. Margaret's eyes softened as she watched. "You remind me of myself," she said quietly. "Alone in a house that pretended to love me, I learned early that truth must be protected. Now it is your turn. Protect it, use it, and never let them tell you again that you are less." We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that heals rather than harms. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, the world moving as it always did. But inside Margaret's dining room, something had shifted forever. When I finally stood to leave, she pressed the envelope back into my hands. "Take this with you. Keep it safe. You'll need it." I nodded, unable to speak, the weight of the envelope grounding me. As I stepped into the cool air outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the world in gold. The envelope in my hand caught the light, the wax seal glowing. For a moment, it looked just like the gleam of my silver pen. Two symbols, one story. Back in my apartment that evening, I placed both on the table. The pen, the envelope. Beside them, the folder of trust documents. 3 pillars of truth. 3 reminders that silence had not been wasted, only stored until the moment of reckoning. As the light faded from the window, I whispered to myself, "Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it waits quietly in the hands of those who believe in you, until you are ready to hold it yourself." The room grew dark, but I no longer feared the darkness. Because for the first time in my life, I was not alone in it. The next morning, the air felt different, heavy but sharp, as if the world itself knew I was about to step across a line I could never return from. Margaret's words from the night before still rang in my mind. "Tomorrow, we face this together." I carried her envelope in my bag, the wax seal unbroken, the silver pen clipped to the folder of documents like a sentinel. When I arrived at her house, Margaret was already dressed for battle, though her armor was simple. A dark wool coat, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes steady. She greeted me with a nod, not a smile, because she understood there was nothing light-hearted about what we were about to do. She held her cane in one hand, and in the other she clutched a smaller leather folder worn at the corners but locked with a clasp. The car ride into the city was silent except for the hum of the tires and the rhythm of Margaret's breathing beside me. I glanced at her once, at the calm lines of her profile, and wondered how long she had carried this truth. 20 years more. My chest tightened with gratitude that she had waited and guilt that she had needed to. We arrived at a tall glass building, its reflections splitting the morning light into fragments across the sidewalk. Margaret's attorney, Walter, worked on the 12th floor. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and strong coffee. My shoes clicked against the marble as we crossed to the elevators. Margaret's hand brushed mine briefly, not in comfort, but in solidarity. Walter's office was a mix of gravitas and efficiency. Bookshelves lined with heavy legal volumes, diplomas framed neatly, a long mahogany table at the center, spotless except for a laptop, a notepad, and a tray of water glasses. He rose as we entered, a tall man in his 50s with a calm face, sharpened by decades of listening more than speaking. Margaret introduced us. "Claire, this is Walter. He's been my attorney for 25 years. He knows everything." Walter shook my hand firmly, his eyes holding mine in a way that made me feel seen rather than examined. "Sit down, both of you. We have much to discuss." I lowered myself into the chair, heart pounding. The folder on my lap felt like a weight pressing me into the seat. Walter adjusted his glasses, opened his laptop, and turned it so both Margaret and I could see. "I've reviewed the materials Margaret provided," he began, "and I've dug deeper. What I'm about to show you confirms what you already suspect." He tapped a key and a series of scanned bank statements appeared on the screen. My breath caught as I recognized the names Charles and Evelyn Whitman. Dates stretching back decades. Transfers, withdrawals, deposits. Neat columns of numbers, but behind them entire chapters of my life that had been stolen. Walter pointed to one line highlighted in yellow. This, Claire, is the initial transfer of $850,000 in 1993, the Whitman Adoption Grant, intended solely for your care and education. I stared at the number, my stomach twisting. He tapped again, scrolling down. The funds were distributed into multiple accounts, managed by Charles and Evelyn. Instead of being used for your needs, the bulk of the money was spent on private schooling for Melissa and Eric, vacation homes, and luxury vehicles. The documentation is meticulous. They didn't even bother to hide it. I pressed my hand against my chest, willing my heart to slow. The betrayal I had uncovered the night before was real, but seeing it displayed on official statements gave it a new weight. It was not suspicion, it was a fact. Walter clicked to the next document, a legal memorandum stamped with a red seal. With accrued interest over 27 years, the amount misappropriated totals nearly $2.5 million. The sound of his words seemed to hang in the air. 2.5 million. My vision blurred for a moment, not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. Every missed opportunity, every humiliation disguised as a joke, every sacrifice I made believing there wasn't enough. All the while, there had been more than enough stolen to elevate Melissa and Eric while I struggled. I whispered, without meaning to. 2.5 million. Walter nodded. That is what they owe you, legally, and we can prove it. The red stamp on the memorandum caught my eye. Confidential. Its bold letters glared against the paper as though warning me that the truth was both power and danger. My silver pen rested on the folder, gleaming faintly in the office light. It looked almost like the stamp's reflection. I reached out and touched it, grounding myself in its weight. Margaret leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. You see, Claire, this is no longer about emotions or memories. This is about the law. And the law, when wielded properly, is sharper than any insult they have thrown at you. Walter interlaced his fingers. We will file a civil suit for restitution. With the evidence we have, the case is strong. Beyond that, there is potential for criminal charges, fraud, misappropriation of funds, even financial abuse of a minor. But we'll proceed carefully. The goal is not just retribution. It is restoration. Restoration. The word wrapped itself around me, foreign yet comforting. To be restored was not to erase the past. It was to reclaim what had been stolen, to put balance back where imbalance had thrived. I looked at Walter. They'll fight. Of course, he said simply. People who build their lives on deception always do. But we have facts, and facts are relentless. Margaret's hand touched mine briefly. You have carried silence all these years, Claire. Silence was survival. But now you have something louder. You have proof. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second pushing me closer to a truth I could not ignore. I straightened in my chair. What do I need to do? Walter smiled faintly. For now, keep everything safe. Do not confront them directly. Let the law speak for you. I'll prepare the filings, but your role is to be steady. Do not let their manipulation draw you back into silence. I nodded slowly, the weight of the folder grounding me. The rest of the meeting unfolded in a rhythm both fast and slow. Walter explained procedures, timelines, and risks. I absorbed the information in fragments, my mind caught between the sting of the numbers and the steady drum of determination building inside me. At moments, his words blurred into a hum, but then one phrase would slice through, clearly: restitution, interest, accrued legal obligation. Each one a strike of the gavel in my imagination. At the end, Walter printed a copy of the memorandum, the red stamp glaring. He slid it across the table toward me. Keep this with you. It is the blade we will carry. I reached for it, the silver pen glinting in my other hand, and pressed the paper into my folder. For a moment, I simply sat there, breathing deeply, letting the reality sink in. Margaret rose slowly, her cane tapping against the floor, and looked at me with pride. This is only the beginning, Claire. But beginnings matter. As we left the office, the weight in my chest felt different. Not just heaviness, but strength. The kind of weight a sword carries before it is drawn. When I returned to my apartment, I set the folder on the table. I clicked the pen softly, the sound echoing in the quiet room. It no longer felt like a memory. It felt like preparation. I closed the folder firmly, my eyes steady, and whispered to the silence around me. The law is my weapon now. The folder lay on my table like a silent guardian, the red stamp. Confidential still visible through the thin flap where I had slid Walter's memorandum inside. The silver pen rested across it as always gleaming faintly in the lamplight. I had just brewed tea, trying to calm the restlessness in my chest when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first, but the moment I answered, the voice on the other end chilled me. "Stop digging, Claire. You don't know what you're starting." It was Eric. His voice was sharp, stripped of the smugness he usually wore in person, replaced with something darker, panic dressed as control. I felt my hand tighten around the phone. For a moment, I considered hanging up, but then I noticed the little app icon at the edge of my screen, one I had installed months ago when a colleague recommended it. A recorder. I slid my thumb across, and the small red light blinked on. I leaned back in my chair, letting my silence stretch. Eric repeated himself more forcefully this time. "Claire, I'm serious. You have no idea what you're walking into. This isn't a game." I swallowed, steadying my breath. My voice came out calm, colder than I expected. "Actually, Eric, I know exactly what I'm starting." There was a pause on the line, as if he hadn't expected resistance. He laughed bitterly. "You think you can take us down with your little sob story? You're an adopted charity case who's gotten way too comfortable biting the hand that fed you." The red light blinked steadily on my desk. Each flash felt like a metronome counting the beats of his downfall. He kept talking, spilling words that revealed more than he realized. "You don't understand how deep this goes. Dad made arrangements years ago. Money moved in ways you'll never trace. Melissa and I, we were supposed to benefit. That's how it works, Claire. Blood before strays." My grip on the phone tightened, but I forced myself to stay still. His words were poison, but poison documented becomes evidence. Eric lowered his voice suddenly, as if afraid someone might overhear him even in his own house. "Drop this now and maybe we can work something out. Maybe we let you keep your little apartment, maybe even cut you a check to stay quiet. But if you keep pressing Claire, you'll regret it." I almost smiled, though the weight of it pressed against my chest. Regret was a language I knew fluently. I had regretted every birthday where my name was forgotten, every classroom where I sat in secondhand clothes, every dinner where Melissa's triumphs were toasted while mine were ignored. I had lived in regret so long that it had lost its power to frighten me. I kept my voice even. "I don't need your checks, Eric. And I don't need your permission." His tone sharpened, brittle and furious. "You think the law will protect you, will bury you in paperwork, drag this out until you're broke and broken. You can't win against us." The blinking red light seemed to pulse brighter, as though it knew he had just handed me another weapon. I let a silence fall, then said quietly, "No, Eric. I think you've already lost." I ended the call before he could answer. For a moment the room was utterly still, except for the pounding of my heart. Then the recorder beeped softly, saving the file. That sound was small, but it carried the weight of a gavel striking wood. Evidence. I leaned back, staring at the phone at the red light, now gone dark. For years, Eric's voice had been one of power in my life. Loud, mocking, dismissive. But recorded it was different. Recorded it became a confession. I opened the app, labeling the file with careful precision Eric call threat. As the text appeared on the screen, I realized something important. The powerless don't remain powerless forever. Sometimes all it takes is the choice to turn a threat into proof. I slid the phone next to the folder, the pen gleaming across both. The tools of my survival had transformed into weapons of truth. That night, as I prepared the recording to send to Walter, I felt the first true shift of momentum. They had underestimated me for decades, believing silence meant surrender. But silence paired with evidence is not surrender. It is a strategy. When I finally crawled into bed, the city humming outside my window, I repeated the words that had carried me through the call. Actually, I know exactly what I'm starting. And with each repetition, I believed it more. The next morning, I delivered the file to Walter. His office was quiet as always, his laptop waiting on the table. He listened carefully as the recording played the red indicator light on his device, blinking in time with mine from the night before. When it ended, he looked at me with calm certainty. This, Claire, is exactly what we needed. Their arrogance is their undoing. I nodded, feeling something solid take root inside me. For the first time, it was no longer just my word against theirs. It was their words against themselves. And as Walter saved the file into his secured system, the soft beep marking its entry into the record, I realized the truth of it all. Power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, captured in blinking red light, waiting patiently for the moment it will speak in court. The silver pen caught the sunlight through the window, a thin beam of light running along its surface like a blade. I reached for it, clicked it once, and whispered to myself, "They wanted me silent. Instead, I am writing the record." The message for anyone listening to my story is simple. Never believe threats define you. Even the weakest voice, when recorded, becomes undeniable. The so-called family meeting was not my idea. Evelyn insisted on it, her voice quivering with that performative urgency she used whenever she wanted to make something look respectable. "We need to talk face to face, Claire," she said in the voicemail she left. "Not with lawyers, not with outsiders, just us. Family." The word caught in my throat when I replayed the message. Family. After everything. Still, they tried to dress control in the clothing of kinship. Still, they thought if they spoke softly enough, I might forget the weight of what they had done. I went, but not because I wanted reconciliation. I went because silence in a room full of liars often speaks louder than confrontation. I arrived at their house just before dusk. The curtains were drawn, the porch light already on, though the sun had not yet disappeared. As I walked up the steps, the air felt heavy, almost staged, like the quiet before a performance. Inside, the living room was arranged like an interrogation chamber disguised as hospitality. Chairs pulled into a stiff circle, glasses of water on coasters, the smell of lemon polish too strong. Evelyn sat upright, pearls at her neck, her hands folded like a judge about to pass sentence. Charles leaned back, arms crossed, trying to look composed, but failing. Melissa perched on the edge of her seat, her eyes sharp, her smile too tight. Eric sat with a glass of water in his hand, tapping his foot against the floor with nervous energy. I chose the last empty chair and sat without a word. My silence filled the room heavier than their rehearsed expressions. Evelyn began. "Claire, we are deeply concerned about your recent actions, digging into old documents involving outsiders, stirring up things best left alone. You're being misled, and we want to protect you from making a mistake you'll regret." I didn't move. My hands rested on my lap, my face calm. The stillness seemed to unsettle them. Melissa leaned forward. "You're chasing shadows. That so-called trust money, it went where it needed to. It kept this family together. Without it, Eric and I wouldn't have had the opportunities we did. Isn't that what family does? We share." The word share twisted in my chest. They called it sharing when it was taking. They called it family when it was exclusion. I stayed silent, letting the echo of her words hang in the air. Eric finally broke. He slammed the glass of water down on the table, some of it splashing onto the polished wood. "Enough pretending," he snapped. "Claire already knows. The money was used for Melissa's school, her clothes, and her life. So what? That's what Dad decided. That's what Mom agreed to." The room froze. The words hung heavy and undeniable. For a split second, no one breathed. Melissa's face flushed deep red, her eyes blazing. "You idiot," she hissed. "Why would you say that out loud?" The glass in Eric's hand slipped from his grip and fell to the floor. It shattered water, spreading across the rug shards, scattering in every direction. The sound cracked through the room like a gavel, sharp and final. I exhaled slowly. My silence was no longer empty. It was a mirror. They saw themselves reflected in it, and they didn't like what they saw. Charles shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. Eric, be quiet. But the damage was done. His admission couldn't be pulled back, not even if they tried to smother it with denial. I watched the water seep into the rug, clear and cold, spreading wider and wider, impossible to contain. Evelyn's voice trembled now, the control slipping. Claire, don't twist this. Everything we did to keep the family stable. You benefited too. You had a roof, food, and a home. I finally lifted my eyes to hers. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is an indictment. Melissa hissed again, her voice sharp with fury. She's not even responding. Look at her. Sitting there like she's better than us. Better. The word struck me as both an insult and a confession. They had always known I carried something they didn't. Not wealth, not status, but resilience. They hated it because they couldn't take it from me. I rose slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor. Their eyes followed me, desperate, angry, afraid. Without a word, I turned and walked toward the door. The shards of glass crunched faintly under my shoe. One more reminder that truth once broken open can never be made whole again for those who tried to hide it. Outside, the air hit my face, cool and sharp. I stood on the porch, inhaling deeply, the sky stretched wide with the last streaks of sunlight. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of exclusion pressing on me. I felt clarity. Behind me, muffled voices erupted, anger, panic, accusation. But their noise no longer held power. I stepped down from the porch, each breath steady, each step deliberate. The lesson was simple and profound. Lies can be rehearsed, manipulation can be planned, but truth always finds its way out. It leaks through careless words, it spills like water across a rug, it shatters like glass. No one can piece together again. As I walked away from that house, the silver pen in my pocket tapped softly, with each stride a rhythm of resolve. I whispered to myself, not as a vow, but as recognition. The truth does not need me to shout it. It only needs me to carry it until it reveals itself. And tonight it had. The night of Charles's birthday arrived like a storm I had seen building on the horizon. Their invitations had gone out weeks before, dripping with arrogance, as if nothing had shifted, as if humiliation could be buried under champagne flutes and speeches about legacy. I would not have attended on my own. But Margaret insisted. She had a plan, and her timing was exact. The restaurant they chose was lavish, the kind of place where chandeliers looked like frozen rain and every tablecloth was white enough to blind you. Guests chattered loudly, clinking glasses, offering congratulations to Charles as though he were a king on his throne. Evelyn glowed beside him, Melissa hovering like a jewel at her shoulder, Eric playing the role of charming heir. They looked untouchable. They looked like a family united. But illusion can be shattered in a single sound. Margaret sat quietly until the main course had been served. She had dressed simply, but there was no mistaking her presence. Even seated, she carried the kind of authority that silences a room when she chooses to use it. When she rose, leaning on her cane for balance, the conversation faltered. When she spoke, they stopped altogether. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice cutting through the air. "I have something to say." The room froze. A fork clattered against a plate somewhere, the sound sharp in the silence. Evelyn's smile faltered. Charles stiffened. Melissa frowned, and Eric shifted uncomfortably. Guests glanced at one another, sensing that something was about to unfold, something more interesting than a birthday toast. Margaret placed a manila folder on the table in front of her. Beside it, gleaming under the chandelier's light, she set my silver pen. The sight of it took my breath away. The symbol of my childhood, my silence, my survival now resting beside legal truth. She began slowly, her words deliberate. "For many years I have watched this family. I have seen what happens behind the polished dinners and staged photographs. I have seen cruelty dressed as humor, exclusion disguised as tradition, and I have seen one person treated as less, though she has shown herself to be more than any of you. Melissa's laugh cut through the silence, sharp and forced. Mother, please not now. This is a celebration. Be quiet, Margaret said, sharper than I had ever heard. Her gaze swept across them, then rested on me. Claire has endured more than any child should. She was taken in at 5 years old, promised a family. Instead, she was given a cage. The air thickened. Charles leaned forward, his voice low and warning. Enough, no, Margaret said firmly. Not enough. For 27 years you have profited from her pain. Money meant for her care was diverted to fund Melissa's indulgences and Eric's ambitions. You mocked her, belittled her, erased her. Tonight, that ends. Gasps rippled through the room. Some guests covered their mouths, and others whispered in shock. Evelyn's face drained of color. That's not true, she stammered. Tell them, Charles. Tell them this isn't true. But Margaret's words were relentless. I have receipts, bank statements, trust documents, proof. Melissa slammed her hand on the table. This is ridiculous. She's not even blood. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her voice cold and clear. She's more family than you've ever been. The words sliced through the air, final and unarguable. Evelyn sputtered. Charles's jaw clenched. Eric's face twisted with rage. But Margaret was not finished. She opened the folder, drew out a set of papers, and laid them on the table beside the pen. This is my new will, signed and notarized. Every asset I own, every house, every account, every investment will pass to Claire. Silence fell like a blow. The weight of it pressed against my chest. I had known this moment was coming, but hearing it aloud in that room was something else entirely. For years I had been invisible, my existence tolerated at best. Now the spotlight was on me, searing and undeniable. The reaction came like an explosion. Evelyn gasped, clutching her pearls. Charles pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly. Melissa's voice rose in a shrill cry. You can't do this. You can't leave everything to her. Eric stood abruptly, his glass of water in his hand. He pointed toward me, his voice shaking with fury. She doesn't deserve it. She never has. She is nothing without us. And then, as if the universe itself demanded punctuation, the glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Water spread across the tile, shards of crystal glinting under the lights. The sound rang through the silence like a gavel striking wood. Everyone stared. No one spoke. The truth was on the table, undeniable and absolute. Margaret's voice broke the silence, once more steady and unwavering. You wanted to talk about family, then let us talk about what family truly means. Family is not blood. It is love. It is respect. It is the willingness to lift someone rather than tear them down. By those measures, Claire is the only true family in this room. Forks slipped from hands, clattering onto plates, each sound a small echo of the larger fracture that had just taken place. The guests sat frozen, some staring at me with pity, others with admiration, others with guilt for never noticing. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, the silver pen gleaming on the table as though waiting for me to pick it up and sign my own destiny. I felt no need to raise my voice, no need to argue. The truth was already doing the work. Melissa hissed, her voice trembling with rage. This isn't over. But in my heart, I knew it was. Not the battles to come, not the legal filings, or the desperate attempts to claw back what was gone, but the illusion that they could control the story that had ended tonight. I looked at Margaret, her chin lifted, her eyes burning with quiet triumph. For the first time, I felt what it meant to be truly defended. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint sound of glass shards settling on the floor. It was the sound of an empire collapsing one shard at a time. And as I breathed in deeply, steadying myself, I understood the lesson etched into this night. Blood does not define family, character does, and no amount of denial could change that. The room remained frozen as I rose from my chair. The weight of their stares pressed against me, but I walked steadily toward the door. The silver pen caught the light as I passed, gleaming like a blade. I left it there beside the will, a symbol that the story had been written and signed in truth. Behind me, silence reigned, broken only by the sharp sound of a fork falling, echoing through the room like a final verdict. Outside, the air was cool and clean. I filled my lungs, each breath a declaration. Tonight had not just been a confrontation, it had been liberation. Because sometimes justice does not arrive in courtrooms or through shouting matches. Sometimes it arrives quietly through the firm voice of someone who has seen too much to remain silent. And sometimes it arrives in the sound of glass shattering in the silence that follows, in the undeniable weight of truth finally spoken aloud. And as I stood on the sidewalk, the city lights blinking in the distance, I knew this, my story was no longer theirs to tell. It was mine. And I would carry it forward, not with rage, but with the dignity of someone who had survived long enough to see justice find its way into the light. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in the way silence sat heavy on every surface, in the way eyes watched with measured weight, waiting for truth to be stamped into permanence. Margaret sat beside me, her cane resting against the polished bench, her presence steady and unwavering. Walter, calm as always, had spread the documents neatly before him. Across the aisle, Evelyn and Charles avoided my gaze. Melissa's jaw clenched tight. Eric slouched as though he had already surrendered. The judge entered and we rose. My heart pounded, but it was not fear anymore. It was anticipation. The sound of the gavel struck once sharp and final, calling the session to order. Walter stood, his voice steady as he presented the evidence. Bank statements traced the flow of the adoption grant, showing how the funds intended for me had been siphoned into accounts that fed Melissa's tuition, Eric's cars, and vacation homes. He played the recording of Eric's threat, the words filling the courtroom like a confession. The air grew thick with tension as the truth unfolded in neat lines of numbers and careless words they could not take back. Evelyn tried to interrupt, her voice breaking. "This is being twisted. We gave Claire everything she needed. She had a home, food, and clothes." But the judge silenced her with a glance, then turned back to Walter. The evidence continued. Margaret's will was submitted, her signature clean, the silver pen still bearing the mark of ink that sealed it. Documents of ownership, investments, deeds, all bypassing the hands of those who had abused trust and landing in mine. When it was over, the judge leaned forward. His words were clear, steady, and undeniable. "The court finds in favor of Claire Whitman. The misappropriated funds with interest totaled $2.5 million and must be returned in full. Furthermore, the will of Margaret Thompson is recognized as valid and binding. Claire Whitman is the legal heir of the estate." The gavel struck again, echoing through the room like thunder rolling through the bones of the building. For a moment, no one moved. Melissa gasped. Eric cursed under his breath, and Charles buried his face in his hands. Evelyn whispered something I couldn't hear, her shoulders trembling. I felt a weight lift, not because money or property had been restored, but because truth had been spoken in a place where it could not be erased. Later, when we left the courthouse, reporters crowded near the steps, their voices loud, questions flung like stones. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Margaret's hand brushed mine as we walked toward the car. "You don't need their noise," she murmured. "The law has spoken. Let that be enough." And it was. But deep inside, I knew I had a choice to make. What I did next would define whether I carried this story as a scar or as a seed. Weeks later, I sat in a quiet office overlooking the city, papers spread before me once again. This time, they were no evidence of theft or betrayal. They were the founding documents of a trust drafted in my name. At the top was a simple title, the Silver Pen Foundation. I placed Margaret's envelope beside it, unbroken, still a reminder of her faith in me. I reached for the silver pen, turning it in my fingers, the weight familiar, the cool metal grounding me. For years it had been a symbol of silent endurance. Now it would become a signature of something larger, I pressed the pen to the paper, signing my name across the document that established a fund for children like me, those who had been adopted but forgotten, those promised family, but given exclusion. Money could not rewrite the past, but it could carve out a future for someone else. As the ink dried, I whispered aloud the words steady. The best revenge wasn't taking back money. It was building what they never gave me. Margaret smiled softly from across the table, her eyes glistening. That's the Claire I always knew was waiting to rise. I closed the folder gently, the pen still warm in my hand. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the sound of my breath. I thought of Evelyn's dismissive laugh, Melissa's cutting words, Eric's threats. They no longer stung. They no longer defined me. Their voices had been loud for so long, but now they were only echoes fading into silence. Outside, the morning sun stretched across the skyline. The city shimmered as though washed clean. I stepped to the window, feeling its warmth on my face. For the first time in decades, I felt not like an outsider pressing against glass, but like someone standing in the light. I remembered Margaret's words spoken when she first gave me the pen as a child. One day you'll write your own story, not theirs. And here I was, pen in hand, signature on paper, a story no longer stolen. The message for anyone listening to my journey is simple. Justice is not only about punishment, it is about restoration. True revenge is not destruction, but transformation, turning wounds into windows, scars into foundations, silence into legacies. As I left the office that morning, the silver pen tucked in my pocket, the city alive around me, I lifted my face to the sky. The clouds parted, sunlight breaking through in wide golden strokes. The camera of life, if it were filming me, would have panned upward past the buildings, past the sky, into the infinite. Because my story no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. And I intended to live it not in bitterness, but in the quiet triumph of someone who turned pain into a new beginning. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.